For God's sake, Dad. You can't even follow simple instructions anymore. I asked you to stay in your room during the dinner party. Do you have any idea how embarrassing it was when you started telling those old war stories to my boss? James slammed his fist on the dining table, making the silverware jump. Colonel Frank Harrison, retired U.S. Army, 72 years old with a distinguished 40-year military career, stood ramrod straight despite the verbal assault from his son. The medals and commendations that once adorned his chest might as well have been made of paper for all the respect they commanded in his own home. I simply came down to get my medication, Frank said evenly, the discipline of decades in command keeping his voice steady. Your medication could have waited, snapped Diane, his daughter-in-law, rolling her eyes as she collected the breakfast dishes. James has been trying to get this promotion for months, and your little stunt might have cost him everything. Frank noticed how she said, "Your little stunt," the same tone she might use to scold their terrier when it had an accident on the carpet. I apologize if my presence was inconvenient, Frank said, the words tasting bitter on his tongue. A man who had once commanded hundreds of troops, made life-or-death decisions under enemy fire, and received the Silver Star for valor was apologizing for walking through his own home to get his heart medication. Inconvenient? James laughed harshly. Dad, you're increasingly becoming a liability. Maybe it's time we considered alternative arrangements for you. The threat hung in the air. Frank knew exactly what alternative arrangements meant. The assisted living facility they had driven past last month, with its sterile corridors and vacant-eyed residents staring out windows. A far cry from the home he had purchased 30 years ago with his late wife, Martha. The home where James had grown up. The home that was still, legally and rightfully, his. Frank retreated to his bedroom. Once the master suite of the house, now reduced to the smallest bedroom at the end of the hall after James and Diane had decided they needed more space 6 months into their temporary stay. 2 years had passed since they moved in after James lost his job and Diane's interior design business faltered. 2 years of gradually being relegated to the margins of his own life. Frank sat on the edge of his bed and looked around at the cramped space. His military memorabilia, once proudly displayed throughout the home, was now crammed onto a single shelf. His books were stacked in precarious towers in the corner because Diane had decided his bookshelf clashed with the aesthetic of the hallway. Even Martha's photograph had been moved from its place of honor in the living room to his bedside table, deemed too old-fashioned for the modern decor Diane had implemented using Frank's credit card. Frank's gaze fell on that photograph now. Martha in her garden, smiling that smile that had sustained him through 3 combat deployments. They've forgotten who I am, Martha, he whispered to the image. They've forgotten what I'm capable of. The colonel felt something stir inside him. Not the resignation and quiet defeat that had become his daily companions, but something older and more familiar. The strategic mind that had earned him his rank, the tactical awareness that had saved his men countless times in the field. Frank reached under his bed and pulled out a small locked box. Inside was a leather-bound journal he had started keeping 6 months ago when he first noticed the pattern of disrespect and marginalization. Methodically, with the precision of a military report, he had documented every incident, dates, times, exact quotes, financial transactions made without his knowledge using his accounts, the evidence of a systematic campaign to remove him from command of his own life. Frank added the morning's confrontation to the log, his handwriting as crisp and orderly as it had been when he wrote field reports decades ago. Then he picked up his phone and dialed a number he had been contemplating calling for weeks. Judge Advocate General's Office, Retired Personnel Division. How may I direct your call? This is Colonel Frank Harrison, retired. I'd like to speak with Colonel Michael Sullivan, if he's available. Frank felt a slight smile form on his lips. Michael Sullivan had been a young JAG officer under his command during his last deployment. Now, 20 years later, Sullivan was nearing retirement himself, but still maintained a private practice specializing in elder law and veterans affairs. Frank, it's been too long, Sullivan's voice boomed through the phone a moment later. How are you holding up? I've been better, Mike. I find myself in need of legal counsel regarding my domestic situation. Say no more. Can you come to my office tomorrow at 900? The familiar military time reference brought another small smile to Frank's face. Affirmative, I'll be there. After hanging up, Frank heard voices from downstairs, James and Diane, discussing him as if he were a problem to be solved rather than a person to be respected. We can't keep living like this, Diane was saying, her voice carrying easily through the heating vent. He's becoming more difficult every day. What do you suggest? James sounded tired. The assisted living place costs a fortune, and we can't afford our own place yet. Well, the house will eventually be yours anyway, right? Maybe we could leverage that somehow. Take out a home equity loan or something. Frank's blood ran cold. They were planning to take out a loan against his house. The house that was fully paid off. The house that represented 40 years of careful saving and planning. I'm thinking we could use the equity to start that business I've been talking about, Diane continued, and maybe remodel this place completely. It's so outdated and your father's taste is, well, you know. He'd never agree to that, James said, though he sounded more resigned than opposed to the idea. He might not have a choice soon, Diane replied, her voice dropping slightly, but still audible. Dr. Matthews mentioned cognitive assessments the last time we took him in. If he's deemed incapable of managing his own affairs. She let the implication hang in the air. Frank felt the room spin slightly. They were actually discussing having him declared incompetent. His son, the boy he had taught to ride a bike, the young man he had put through college with his military salary, was contemplating stripping him of his legal rights to gain control of his assets. Frank's military training kicked in like it had never left. Assess the situation, identify the threats, develop a strategy, execute with precision. It was time to fight back, but not with angry confrontations or emotional outbursts. Those were amateur tactics. No, this called for a carefully orchestrated campaign. The colonel had one final mission to complete, Operation Dignity, and he would not fail. The next morning, Frank woke at 0500 hours, as he had every day for the past 50 years. His body might be older, but the discipline remained ingrained. He dressed carefully in one of his better suits, not the full dress uniform he sometimes longed to wear, but appropriate civilian attire for a meeting with legal counsel. When he emerged from his room at 0630, James and Diane were still asleep, accustomed to rising much later. Frank moved quietly through the house that had once been unquestionably his domain. He prepared a simple breakfast, cleaned up after himself meticulously, and was out the door by 0700, leaving a brief note. Gone for the day. Do not wait on my account. He drove himself to the bank first, arriving just as it opened. The manager, Mrs. Chen, greeted him warmly. She had handled his accounts for over a decade and knew him as a meticulous, financially responsible client. Colonel Harrison, what brings you in so early today? I need to make some changes to my accounts, Mrs. Chen. Some significant changes. By the time Frank left the bank an hour later, he had opened new accounts at a different financial institution, transferred substantial portions of his savings and investments, removed James as an authorized user on his remaining accounts, and placed his most important documents, including the house deed and Martha's will, in a new safe deposit box to which only he had access. His next stop was a small technology store where a young veteran worked, a former sergeant who had always addressed Frank as Colonel and treated him with the respect his rank deserved. Colonel Harrison, what can I help you with today? I need a new phone, son. One that isn't on my family's plan, and I'd appreciate some help setting up new email accounts and securing my passwords. The young man who had served in cyber operations was more than happy to assist. By the time Frank arrived at Sullivan's office at precisely 0900, he had already completed the first phase of his counter-offensive. Michael Sullivan hadn't changed much over the years, still trim and sharp-eyed, though his hair had gone completely gray. He then rose and offered a crisp salute when Frank entered, a gesture of respect that brought an unexpected lump to Frank's throat. At ease, counselor, Frank said with a small smile. It's good to see you, Mike. Likewise, Colonel. Now tell me what's going on. For the next 2 hours, Frank methodically laid out the situation, the gradual erosion of his authority in his own home, The financial exploitation, the plans he had overheard, the threats of having him declared incompetent. He presented his journal with its detailed documentation, as well as bank statements showing questionable charges to his accounts. Sullivan listened intently, occasionally taking notes, his expression growing increasingly grim. This is elder abuse, Frank. Plain and simple. And it's more common than you might think, especially with family members. I don't want to destroy my son, Mike. I just want my dignity back, and I want him to learn to stand on his own 2 feet, as I taught him to do. Sullivan nodded. I understand. We won't go nuclear unless absolutely necessary, but we do need to establish clear boundaries, legally and financially. By the time Frank left Sullivan's office, they had developed a comprehensive strategy. Sullivan would prepare a legal letter clearly establishing Frank's rights as the homeowner, outlining the terms under which James and Diane could continue to live there, including fair market rent and clearly defined boundaries regarding use of common areas and decision-making authority. He would also draft a new will and power of attorney documents that would protect Frank's interests while still providing for his son's future in a controlled manner. And Frank, Sullivan said as they concluded their meeting, I'm going to connect you with a real estate agent friend of mine. Not because you should sell, but because you should know the current market value of your property. Knowledge is power in these situations. Agreed, Frank said, shaking Sullivan's hand. I've always found that understanding the terrain is essential to winning the battle. Frank's final stop that day was at a place he had initially resisted, visiting the Riverside Veterans Community, a condominium complex designed specifically for military retirees. It wasn't the depressing assisted living facility James and Diane had in mind, but rather an independent living community where many of the residents were active, engaged seniors with military backgrounds. The leasing agent, herself a retired Navy officer, gave him a comprehensive tour. We have a full fitness center, Colonel Harrison. Many of our residents maintain rigorous physical training regimens. We also have a tactical training simulator, book clubs, investment groups, and regular social events. Most importantly, every resident here is the commanding officer of their own life in space. Frank observed the residents as they moved around the community. Men and women his age or older, but walking with the distinctive bearing of military personnel. No slumped shoulders or defeated expressions here. They nodded respectfully to each other in passing, and several recognized his bearing as a fellow service member, offering him the courtesy of a slight nod or a "Good morning, sir," without even knowing his rank. By the time he returned home that evening, Frank had a clear picture of his options and a strategic plan worthy of his military background. James and Diane were in the living room, looking worried and annoyed simultaneously. "Where have you been?" "All day?" James demanded as Frank entered. "We were concerned." "Were you?" Frank replied calmly. "I left a note." "A note saying you'd be gone all day isn't exactly informative," Diane snipped. "What if something had happened to you? Then I would have handled it, as I've been handling my affairs for over 70 years. Frank hung up his coat neatly. "I'm quite capable of managing my own schedule, thank you." Something in his tone must have alerted them that something had changed. James and Diane exchanged glances. "Dad, we're just concerned about your well-being," James said, his voice taking on that condescending softness Frank had come to despise. "There's no need to get defensive." "I'm not defensive, James. I'm simply establishing a fact. Now, if you'll excuse me, I've had a full day and would like to rest." Frank moved toward his bedroom, then paused and turned back. "Oh, and we'll be having a family meeting tomorrow evening at 1800 hours, 6 p.m. for you civilians. I expect both of you to be present and prepared for a serious discussion about the future arrangements in this household." Without waiting for a response, Frank continued to his room, closing the door firmly behind him. Through the door, he heard Diane's incredulous whisper, "Did he just give us an order?" Frank smiled to himself as he prepared for bed. Yes, he had. And it was about time. The next day, Frank maintained radio silence with James and Diane, leaving early again and returning just before the appointed hour for their meeting. He had spent the day with Sullivan finalizing documents, visiting the bank again to complete his financial reorganization, and meeting with a property assessor who confirmed what Sullivan's real estate agent friend had told him. His house, purchased 30 years ago for $120,000, was now worth approximately $580,000 in the current market. When Frank entered the dining room at exactly 1800 hours, he carried a leather portfolio containing all the documents he and Sullivan had prepared. James and Diane were already seated at the table, looking uncomfortable and slightly defiant. "Thank you for being punctual," Frank said, taking his seat at the head of the table, a position he had ceded to James months ago, but now reclaimed without comment. "I'll come straight to the point. The current living arrangement in this house needs to change immediately. If this is about yesterday morning, Dad, I apologize if I was short with you," James began, but Frank held up a hand to stop him. "This isn't about any single incident, James. It's about a pattern of behavior that has developed over the past 2 years. A pattern that ends today." Frank opened his portfolio and removed the first document, the legal letter Sullivan had prepared. "This is a formal notification that I am the sole legal owner of this property, as confirmed by the deed and your mother's will. All decisions regarding this house, its maintenance, decoration, potential renovations, or sale, rest exclusively with me." He slid the document across the table. James picked it up, skimming it with widening eyes before passing it to Diane, whose face flushed with anger. "What is this? Some kind of legal threat? Against your own family?" she demanded. "It's not a threat, Diane. It's a clarification of fact, one that seems to have been forgotten." Frank removed the next document. "This outlines the new terms under which you may continue to reside in my home. Effective the 1st of next month, you will pay market rate rent of $1,800 per month, plus utilities. You will restrict your use of space to the room specifically allocated to you. You will make no changes to the common areas without my express written permission." James looked stunned. "Dad, you can't be serious. We can't afford that kind of rent. You both work full-time, James. Your combined income is more than adequate to cover reasonable housing costs. If you choose not to accept these terms, you have 30 days to find alternative accommodation." "This is ridiculous." Diane slapped the paper down. "After everything we've done for you." Frank cut her off with a look that had once silenced insubordinate officers. "What exactly have you done for me, Diane? Occupied my home rent-free for 2 years? Relegated me to the smallest bedroom? Removed my possessions and photographs from common areas? Discussed having me declared incompetent so you could access the equity in my property?" Diane paled at the last statement. You heard that? The heating vents in this house have always carried sound remarkably well. Something I mentioned when you first moved in, if you recall." Frank turned his attention back to James, whose expression had shifted from indignation to shame. "Son, I didn't raise you to be dependent on others. I didn't raise you to take advantage of family, and I certainly didn't raise you to treat your father with such disrespect. Dad, we were just trying to help. We thought you needed—" "I don't need your kind of help," Frank interrupted firmly. "What I need is my dignity. What I need is for my son to be the man I taught him to be." Frank placed a third document on the table. "This is the current market valuation of this house. As you can see, it's worth considerably more than when I purchased it. Should I decide to sell, which I am actively considering, I would have more than enough to purchase a very comfortable unit at the Riverside Veterans Community and still have substantial savings remaining." The revelation that Frank had actually visited the retirement community seemed to shock James more than anything else. "You're thinking of moving to a retirement home? Voluntarily? The Riverside is not a retirement home, as you seem to imagine. It's an independent living community, specifically designed for military veterans. I would have my own apartment, my own schedule, and the company of people who understand the meaning of respect and discipline." Frank could see the realization dawning on both their faces. He wasn't bluffing and he wasn't helpless. He had options they hadn't anticipated. "Now," Frank continued, reaching for the final document in his portfolio, "this is a record of all unauthorized charges made to my accounts over the past year. Diane's spa memberships, James's golf club dues, the furniture purchases, the vacations, the expensive dinners, none of which I was invited to join, I might add. The total comes to just over $42,000. Dad, we can explain, James began, but Frank continued as if he hadn't spoken. I'm not asking for repayment, though legally I would be entitled to it. Instead, I'm using this as evidence of a pattern of financial exploitation that would be very relevant should you decide to pursue having me declared incompetent. He let that sink in before delivering the final blow. I've already transferred the majority of my assets to new accounts to which you have no access. I've changed my will to place my estate in a trust that will release funds to you only under certain conditions. And I've appointed Michael Sullivan, you remember Colonel Sullivan from the JAG Corps, don't you, James, as my power of attorney for both financial and healthcare decisions should I ever become truly incapacitated. The stunned silence that followed was more satisfying than Frank had anticipated. He allowed it to stretch for several long moments before continuing in a softer tone. I don't want to be at war with my own son. I don't want to sell this house, where we have so many memories of your mother, but I will not continue to be treated as an incompetent burden in my own home. Frank stood, gathering his documents back into the portfolio. You have until the end of the month to decide. Either agree to the new terms and behave as respectful tenants, or find yourselves a new place to live. I'll be in my study. Yes, my study, which I am reclaiming effective immediately. Should you wish to discuss this further once you've had time to process. Frank left them sitting in shocked silence and walked to what had once been his study, now cluttered with Diane's craft supplies and exercise equipment. He began methodically moving these items into the hallway, reclaiming the space that had once been his sanctuary. As he worked, he heard the heated discussion erupting in the dining room. "This is your fault," Diane was saying. "You let him walk all over us." "My fault? You're the one who's been spending his money like water and talking about having him." Declared incompetent. "How could you?" "Don't act innocent. You were right there agreeing with me. And now what are we supposed to do? We can't afford almost $2,000 in rent." "Well, maybe if you hadn't quit your job at the design firm to build your brand on Instagram, we'd have more income." Frank tuned out their bickering and continued organizing his study. Martha's photograph returned to its place of honor on the desk. His military commendations went back on the wall. His books reclaimed their rightful place on the shelves. By the time there was a tentative knock on the study door an hour later, Frank had transformed the space back into a command center worthy of his rank. "Enter," he called, not looking up from the book he was now comfortably reading in his old leather chair. James appeared in the doorway alone, his expression a mixture of contrition and apprehension. "Dad, can we talk?" "Of course. Have a seat." Frank gestured to the chair across from him. Not with the false patience one might offer a child, but with the professional courtesy of one adult addressing another. James sat, looking around at the transformed study. "You've been busy. Just restoring order. Something I should have done long ago." James nodded, then took a deep breath. "Dad, I owe you an apology. A real one, not the placating kind I've been offering lately." He paused, seeming to struggle with his next words. I've been treating you the way I feared becoming. Dependent, irrelevant, past my prime. I think in trying to manage you, I was really trying to manage my own fear of aging and becoming obsolete." It was more insight than Frank had expected from his son. "That's a mature observation, James. Diane and I have been talking, arguing really, but we've come to some decisions." James straightened his posture unconsciously, perhaps responding to his father's military bearing. "We're going to find our own place. Not because we're angry or because we can't afford your terms, though frankly, they'd be tight, but because it's the right thing to do. We've been taking advantage of your generosity, and it's time we stood on our own feet." Frank felt a complex mixture of emotions, pride in his son's decision, relief at the prospect of reclaiming his home, and a twinge of sadness at the distance that had grown between them. "I think that's a wise decision. It won't be anything fancy at first, but it will be ours." James hesitated, then added, "I was hoping maybe you could help me figure out a realistic budget. You were always good at that, and I clearly need some guidance." It was a small olive branch, but a significant one. James acknowledging that his father still had valuable wisdom to offer. "I'd be happy to, son. Tomorrow evening, perhaps, after you've had time to gather your financial information." James nodded, then looked around the study again. "You know, I remember sitting in here as a kid, watching you work. You always seemed to know exactly what you were doing. I wanted to be like that, so certain, so in command." The secret of command, James, is that no one is ever completely certain. We just learn to act decisively despite the uncertainty. Frank set his book aside. "Your mother knew that better than anyone. She used to say that courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing what needs to be done despite the fear." "I miss her," James said quietly. "She wouldn't be very proud of how I've been treating you." "No, she wouldn't," Frank agreed honestly. "But she'd be proud of you for recognizing it and changing course. That's what real strength is, the ability to recognize when you're on the wrong track and correct your heading." They sat in companionable silence for a moment before James spoke again. "Diane's pretty upset. She thought, well, she had plans for this house that obviously aren't going to happen now." "Diane will adjust," Frank said simply. "Just as you will, just as I have had to adjust many times throughout my life." "Yes, sir." The reflexive response, addressing him as sir for the first time in years, brought a slight smile to Frank's face. "That will be all for now, son. We'll talk more tomorrow." James stood, hesitated as if wanting to say more, then simply nodded and left the study, closing the door behind him. Frank sat in his reclaimed territory, feeling the first real sense of victory he had experienced in years. It wasn't the triumph of destroying an enemy, but the satisfaction of restoring proper order, of commanding respect not through force, but through strategic action and clear boundaries. He picked up his phone and called Sullivan. "How did it go?" his friend asked immediately. "Mission accomplished, Mike. They'll be moving out by the end of the month." "And how do you feel about that?" "Like a commander who successfully completed a difficult campaign. Tired but satisfied." Sullivan chuckled. "Will you still be selling the house?" Frank considered the question. "I'm keeping my options open. The Riverside is impressive, but this is still my home. Now that I'll be able to live in it on my own terms again, I may decide to stay." "Well, whatever you decide, you've won back your autonomy. That's what matters." "Indeed it is." After ending the call, Frank pulled out his journal and made a new entry, not documenting a grievance this time, but recording a victory. He detailed the meeting, James's reaction, and the plans going forward. It was important to maintain accurate records, even in success. As he wrote, Frank reflected on how his military training had served him in this most personal of battles. The strategic thinking, the attention to detail, the documentation, the clear chain of command. All principles that had guided his career were equally applicable to defending his rights as a senior citizen. Too many of his contemporaries, he knew, suffered silently as their autonomy was eroded by well-meaning but controlling family members. They lacked the tools, the confidence, or the support to fight back. Perhaps Frank thought there was a new mission waiting for him, helping other veterans maintain their dignity and independence as they aged. The Riverside had mentioned they were looking for someone to lead workshops for residents on financial planning and personal rights. It could be a worthy deployment of his skills. Frank closed his journal and looked at Martha's photograph. "Mission accomplished, my dear," he murmured. "Not exactly how we planned our retirement, but then again, the best commanders always adapt to changing conditions on the ground." He could almost hear her laughing response. "At ease, Colonel. You've earned your rest." But Frank knew he wouldn't rest, not completely. There were still battles to be fought, still missions to complete. His campaign for dignity might have secured its primary objective, but the war against the disrespect and marginalization of seniors continued on many fronts, and Colonel Frank Harrison was not one to retire from the field while the battle still raged. He was simply repositioning for the next engagement. Over the next few weeks, Frank witnessed a remarkable transformation in his household. James and Diane, once they accepted the inevitability of moving out, began house hunting in earnest. Frank helped James develop a realistic budget, and to his surprise, Diane participated constructively in these discussions, bringing printouts of affordable rental properties and scaling back her expectations considerably. The tension in the house didn't disappear entirely, but it shifted from toxic resentment to the more natural stress of a family in transition. Frank reclaimed more of his spaces gradually, first his study, then the main bathroom, finally returning to the master bedroom that had always been his. James and Diane didn't fight these changes, seeming to understand that they were simply the rebalancing of scales that had been unfairly tipped for too long. One evening, about 2 weeks after their confrontation, Frank found Diane alone in the kitchen, sorting through cookware. "I'm trying to figure out what's actually ours and what belongs to the house," she explained somewhat stiffly when she noticed him watching. "You're welcome to take any of the kitchen items you need," Frank offered. "Martha would want you to have things to start your new home properly." Diane looked surprised by the gesture. "Thank you, but I think we should start fresh. We've been borrowing too much for too long." It was the closest thing to an apology Frank expected to receive from her, and he accepted it with a nod. "A wise approach. Self-sufficiency is essential to self-respect." She gave him a curious look. "You really believe that, don't you? That people need to stand on their own?" "I believe we all need support at times," Frank clarified. "But yes, I believe true dignity comes from independence, from being needed rather than needy when possible." Diane seemed to consider this, then said, "James has always talked about how strict you were, how you pushed him to be self-reliant. I thought it was harsh, but now I wonder if we've been the harsh ones, trying to take away your self-reliance." It was a moment of surprising insight from a woman Frank had largely dismissed as shallow and entitled. "Perhaps we've all made misjudgments," he offered, not quite an olive branch, but at least an acknowledgement of the complexity of their situation. The conversation didn't lead to a warm reconciliation, but it did ease some of the lingering tension. Diane would likely never be truly close to Frank. Their values and perspectives were too different, but they could at least achieve a respectful detente. 3 weeks after the confrontation, James and Diane signed a lease on a modest 2-bedroom apartment about 20 minutes away. It was within their budget, close to James's workplace, and importantly, entirely their own. The day they moved out was bittersweet. Frank helped carry boxes to their rented moving truck, giving directions based on his extensive experience with military relocations. Heaviest items at the back of the truck against the cab wall. Distribute the weight evenly from side to side. Secure everything with straps. You don't want shifting during transport. James followed these instructions without argument, perhaps finding comfort in the clear guidance after weeks of uncertainty. When the truck was loaded, there was an awkward moment in the driveway. Diane hung back while James approached his father. "So, I guess this is it," James said, hands in his pockets like he was a teenager again. "Not it," Frank corrected. "Just a new deployment, different quarters, same family." He extended his hand formally, and James shook it, then surprised Frank by pulling him into a brief, firm hug. "I'm sorry, Dad, for everything." "Apology accepted, son. Now go build something to be proud of." As the truck pulled away, with Diane following in her car, Frank felt a complex mixture of emotions: satisfaction, relief, a touch of loneliness, but predominantly a sense of rightness. Order had been restored, proper boundaries established, his authority in his own life reaffirmed. In the days that followed, Frank settled into a new routine of his own making. He rose early as always, but now exercised in his living room without fear of disturbing anyone or being judged for his old-fashioned calisthenics. He reclaimed the kitchen, cooking proper meals for himself rather than picking at whatever leftovers James and Diane deigned to share. He invited friends over, fellow veterans he had somewhat neglected during the years of his domestic occupation, and hosted them in his living room without apologizing for the outdated decor or asking permission to use the space. A week after James and Diane moved out, Frank received an unexpected call from Sullivan. "Frank, I've been thinking about your situation and I have a proposition for you." "I'm listening." "The local VFW is starting a new program, Elder Rights Advocacy for Veterans. They're looking for someone to head it up. Someone with leadership experience, strategic thinking, and first-hand knowledge of the challenges facing senior veterans. Frank felt a spark of interest. What exactly would this entail? Education primarily. Workshops on legal rights, financial management, housing options. Some one-on-one consultation with veterans facing situations similar to yours. Coordination with legal resources when necessary. It sounded like a perfect deployment of his skills, a new mission that would give purpose to his hard-won experience. I'd be interested in discussing it further. Excellent. There's a meeting next Tuesday at 1,000 hours. I'll pick you up. After hanging up, Frank walked through his quiet house, considering this new opportunity. The home felt different now, peaceful rather than empty, orderly rather than sterile. He had reclaimed his territory, but perhaps there was more to accomplish beyond these walls. James called that evening, as he had each night since moving out. Brief, slightly awkward conversations that nevertheless represented an effort to rebuild their relationship on healthier terms. We're mostly unpacked, James reported. The place is small, but it's coming together. Good. Proper organization of space is essential in compact quarters. Dad, I've been thinking about what you said, about standing on my own feet.
I've applied for a promotion at work, one I should have pursued a year ago but didn't because it would mean more responsibility. I'm glad to hear it, son. And Diane is interviewing for a position with an actual design firm tomorrow. No.
More of this influencer business that wasn't paying the bills. Frank nodded to himself, pleased by these developments. You're both making sound decisions. There was a pause, then James asked, Would you like to come for dinner this weekend? Nothing fancy. We're still figuring out the kitchen, but we'd like you to see the place. It was a significant invitation, not Frank visiting their space within his home, but being welcomed into their truly independent domain. I'd be honored, James. Thank you. After the call ended, Frank sat in his study, surrounded by the military, commendations and photographs that told the story of his life's service. He picked up the Silver Star in its display case, awarded for valor under fire during a particularly harrowing mission in his younger days. Next to it sat a newer edition, the journal in which he had documented his most recent campaign. Different battlefields, different adversaries, but the same fundamental principles at stake. Honor, dignity, respect, the rights of a man to command his own life and territory. Frank had defended those principles in foreign lands as a younger man. Now, in his 7th decade, he had successfully defended them in the most personal theater of operations, his own home. And in doing so, he had not only secured his own dignity, but had helped his son rediscover his own path to honor and self-respect. It wasn't a perfect victory. Real life rarely offered those. But it was a substantive one. The colonel's final mission had been a success. And like any good commander, he was already preparing for the next deployment. 3 months later, Frank stood at the podium in the Riverside Veterans Community Recreation Hall, addressing a room full of attentive, senior veterans and their family members. Tactical awareness doesn't end when you leave the service, he was saying, his voice steady and authoritative. The skills that kept you alive in combat can keep you independent in civilian life. Documentation, clear communication of boundaries, strategic planning, knowing when to advance and when to hold position. The audience nodded in understanding. These were men and women who spoke the same language, who understood discipline and chain of command. Many of you are facing battles on the home front, Frank continued. Adult children who believe they know what's best for you. Financial pressures, health challenges. Society's perception that your age makes you less capable, less relevant. He paused, looking around the room. I'm here to tell you that those perceptions are incorrect. Your experience, your judgment, your dignity are worth defending with the same vigor you once defended this nation. The Elder Rights Advocacy Program had taken off beyond Sullivan's expectations. What had started as a small initiative at the local VFW had expanded to multiple locations, with Frank as its director and primary speaker. Today's workshop, Maintaining Command of Your Life, Legal and Financial Strategies for Senior Veterans, had drawn nearly 60 participants. Before we break into smaller discussion groups, Frank said, I want to emphasize one critical point. The goal isn't to create adversarial relationships with your families. The goal is to establish mutual respect and clear boundaries. Sometimes, that requires decisive action, but the ultimate objective is harmony, just on appropriate terms. As the formal presentation concluded and participants moved to the breakout sessions, Frank noticed a familiar figure entering at the back of the hall. James stood uncertainly by the door, observing the scene with evident surprise. Frank made his way through the crowd to his son. "I didn't know you were coming today," he said, genuinely pleased by the unexpected visit. "I hope you haven't been waiting long." "Not long," James replied, looking around at the bustling activity. "Sullivan mentioned you were speaking, but I had no idea it would be like this." He gestured to the room full of engaged seniors and the professional materials being distributed. "You've created something important here, Dad." Frank accepted the compliment with a nod. "It addresses a need. Too many veterans face the same challenges I did, but without the resources or knowledge to advocate for themselves." They moved to a quieter corner of the hall. "How are things at the apartment?" Frank asked. The past 3 months had seen a gradual warming in their relationship. Weekly dinners had become a tradition, with Frank visiting their apartment or James and Diane coming to the house, now clearly as guests rather than as entitled occupants. "Good. Tight, but good. Diane got the promotion at the design firm last week." "Excellent. She's talented when she applies herself properly." James smiled at his father's characteristic blend of compliment and assessment. "We're actually starting to save a little. Maybe in a year or two we could look at a small house." "Prudent planning. I've always said that financial discipline is a form of freedom." James hesitated, then said, "That's partly why I came today. I wanted to thank you." For forcing us to grow up. These past months have been hard, but also clarifying. Diane and I are stronger now, more of a team. And I feel like I'm finally becoming the man you tried to raise me to be." Frank felt an unexpected swell of emotion. Pride, vindication, hope. "It's never too late for a course correction, son." "No, sir, it isn't." They stood in companionable silence for a moment, watching the veterans engaged in earnest discussions with the volunteer legal advisors Frank had recruited. "Will you be staying for lunch?" Frank asked eventually. "I'd like that, and actually, I was hoping you might be free this weekend. Lucas has a baseball game, his first as starting pitcher. He specifically asked if Grandpa could come watch." Frank smiled. His relationship with his grandson had been another casualty of the tension with James and Diane, but had begun to heal in recent months. "I wouldn't miss it. 0900 at the community field." James laughed. "Yes, sir. 0900 hours precisely." As James departed and Frank returned to his workshop participants, he reflected on how much had changed since that morning when James had berated him over washing dishes. The battle for dignity had been won, but more importantly, the peace that followed was proving more rewarding than he could have anticipated. Later that day, Frank drove home to the house he had defended so vigorously. He had ultimately decided not to sell, though he maintained his membership at the Riverside community and regularly participated in their activities. His home felt different now, not just a structure he owned, but a command post he had successfully defended, a territory whose boundaries were respected. He parked in the driveway and noticed his elderly neighbor, Mrs. Peterson, struggling with some gardening tools. "Need some assistance there, Margaret?" he called, approaching her fence. "Frank." "Yes, if you wouldn't mind. These old hands aren't what they used to be." As he helped her organize her gardening supplies, she said, "I've been meaning to ask you. My son has been pressuring me to move in with him and his wife. Says it's not safe for me to live alone anymore." Frank recognized the familiar scenario immediately. "And what do you think about that?" "I think I'm not ready to give up my independence. But he's so insistent, and I don't know how to stand my ground without seeming ungrateful." Frank smiled. "As it happens, Margaret, I'm something of an expert in that particular tactical situation. Why don't you come over for coffee tomorrow, and we can discuss some strategies." "Strategies? You make it sound like warfare." "Not warfare," Frank corrected gently. "Just proper boundary maintenance. Every good relationship needs clear boundaries. As they set a time for their coffee meeting, Frank felt a deep sense of satisfaction. His final mission had evolved beyond his personal battle into something larger, a campaign to help others maintain their dignity and autonomy as they aged. He had found a new purpose that utilized all his military training and life experience. Colonel Harrison's last deployment might prove to be his most meaningful yet. That night, as Frank prepared for bed, he looked at Martha's photograph on his nightstand. "Mission accomplished, my dear," he said softly. "And new orders received." He could almost hear her response. "Carry on, Colonel, carry on."